Prof. Welcome. Yeah, thanks for joining us to talk about Alexander Gallas's recent book, Exiting the Factory: Strikes and Class Formation Beyond the Industrial Sector. So yeah, we're very happy to have him here to present the book, and then also to have Andreas Bieler to be the discussant and like share his thoughts on the book itself and on the general themes of it. So yeah, this is how we're gonna organize it. So we'll first have Alex's talk, then Andreas's comments, before then going into the Q&A and discussion with everyone. And as you can see, we're recording this, so please, everyone, just mute yourselves during the talks, and then afterwards we go into the discussion. And yeah, that's pretty much it from my side. So, Alex, the floor is yours.
Okay, good evening. Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to present this major book project of mine to you and discuss it with you. I hope you can hear me well. The sound quality is good enough. I've prepared a PowerPoint. I'm going to talk for about 30-ish minutes, and then Andreas will reply and we'll have a chance to address questions, queries, and get a discussion going. I want to talk about the book or the books. It's a 2-volume book, and do a couple of things, discuss the general research design and the research problem, present some of the findings, and then also discuss a little bit at the end what all of this means for the present moment. Obviously, I did my research over a longer time span, and I was just saying to Bernd and Andreas that I finished my research in about September, October 2022. And it seems like we live in a different age now. So I want to address a little bit also what this means for the present moment. So to introduce the book, it's a 2-volume book, as I said, neatly divided into a theory volume, which is volume 1, which is about class theory, essentially, goes into class theory from a materialist Marxist angle, and then a second volume that is about strike research. The title is a reference to one of the earliest films that exist, which is a silent film called La Sortie de l'usine Lumière à Lyon, which is simply showing workers exiting a factory after a shift. In the case of my book, however, I'm not so much looking at factory work. I'm interested in the question of what happens when strikes take place outside of factory settings. Especially, I was wondering, and you can see this if you have a look at the table of contents here, what this means from a class analytical angle. So what do strikes in the non-industrial areas, in particular in the service sector and in the public sector, mean in terms of working class formation, and also, yeah, to a degree, what does this mean for class politics? So let me discuss a little bit what I mean when I approach my topic this way. Maybe those of you who aren't working in the field of labor studies or are interested in labor studies know the book on the left-hand side, which is an absolute classic in the field of strike research. Richard Hyman's book, Strikes. It shows miners wearing hard hats in front of a mine, I suppose. And it very much invokes the classical image of the striking worker as a middle-aged male industrial worker. The book itself also starts by recounting a strike, and that strike is at a Ford plant in the north of England, where auto workers go on strike. This is how the book starts. On the right-hand side, you see the cover of I newspaper or a cover from 2016. And I added this here because I thought in terms of the image we see here of the striker, the person shown here is completely different. So it's a junior doctor, presumably female, possibly with an immigrant background. So the image of the striker seems to have changed. And I was interested in the question of what that means and what that means also in terms of class relations and class formation. To theorize this, I found a starting point in some of the literature that talked about financialized, globalized capitalism of the early 2000s and its effects on class relations. And essentially, I found two countervailing claims which can be easily juxtaposed. The first one is from Manuel Castells, Spanish sociologist, also politician for some time, in his famous book on the rise of the network society. And I think it is a very typical kind of observation, and typical for the discourse of this time. I remember back then I was a PhD student at the University of Lancaster, and was facing many of these types of debates where people were saying, just like Castells, we are in a new age of capitalism, and what that means for class is that essentially working classes become fragmented. And in a certain way, the type of solidarities that were typical and indicative of the industrial age, they also, to a certain degree, are or become marginalized. So this is expressed in this quote from Castells: "Capital tends to escape in its hyperspace of pure circulation, while labor dissolves its collective entity into an infinite variation of individual existences." This idea of fragmentation. And then there is a more, I guess, Marxist or materialist view on the subject matter, which in this case comes from Leo Panitch. Again, you will find similar quotations in other works of that time, where Panitch says, in the advanced capitalist world, the decline in the size of the traditional industrial labor force is accompanied by the proletarianization of many service and professional occupations and the spread of more unstable, casual and contingent employment. And the key term here is proletarianization. And the idea is, yes, there are processes of deindustrialization in the global north, and they have effects, but there are new sectors of the economy emerging, and in these new sectors, mostly in the service sector, new forms of solidarity emerge. And in that sense, you know, these two quotes can be counterposed and have or make countervailing claims about class formation. On the one hand, Castells indicates, well, working classes become fragmented. Panitch says maybe there are new forms of working classes and there are new processes of working class formation that take place in the context of the reorganization of global capitalism. I thought to look into this issue, it is really a good idea to look at strikes, because to me, strikes are instances where solidarity emerges. And in that sense, strikes are also instances that are important if we want to find out about class formation. And so the research question that I pose in my book is, what are the class effects of non-industrial strikes and how far do they contribute to working class formation? How did I go about doing this kind of research? I started, and this is the whole first volume condensed in just one slide. I have to be very short here in order to get through my presentation. I start from a materialist or Marxist conceptualization of class that heavily draws upon, on the one hand, Nikos Poulantzas, on the other hand, also Beverly Silver. And in that kind of framework, you start from the capitalist relations of production as relations that are characterized by class antagonism, meaning conflict, permanent conflict, and class domination, meaning capital being in a dominant position over labor. And you start from the assumption that there are constant class struggles taking place that are caused by the nature of capitalist relations of production. Silver then observes that in these class struggles, we can observe that processes of class making, class unmaking, and class remaking take place. So this is a dynamic process. And if we take Silver seriously, strikes can then be seen as potential instances of class formation. And what she does in her famous book, Forces of Labor, is essentially say, well, you know, we have claims like Castells' claims that, you know, the working classes vanish. But if we actually look at how capital spreads out across the world and becomes reorganized around the world, and if we look at the matter from a global point of view, we find new forms of labor unrest in new zones of industry, especially in the global south and in emerging economies like India, like China, like Brazil. And in those zones, we also find new forms of working class solidarity. So we see processes of class formation taking place there in industrial zones. And what I was interested in my work is, okay, we have Silver's account of how, industry becomes reorganized at a global scale and what this means for working class formation in new zones of industrialization. My question was more, what happens in zones where processes of deindustrialization take place, where the service sector is possibly on the rise, or where we have public sectors that possibly come under attack in those processes of neoliberalization. You can then ask the question in how far strikes can be seen as instances of working class formation. And I said, well, it is not necessarily the case that each and every strike is an instance of working class formation, but in very many strikes, we see what I would call expansive solidarity, which is solidarity along the lines of labor, of being wage dependent. And the way to gauge this, in my point of view, was to look at the demands of strikes. So are there demands that are potentially transferable to other branches or sectors of the economy? We can look at the constituencies of strikes. So do striking workers develop ties and forms of solidarity with other groups of workers? And then last but not least, we can also look at the mobilizing dynamic of strikes, meaning we need to look into the degree to which strikes are actually supported by broad popular forces, and how populations in different countries see those strikes. I then, with this framing, thought, okay, we are talking here about an issue that is a truly global issue that has to do with the global organization and reorganization of capitalism in the neoliberal age. And so we need to get a handle on this from a global point of view, which is obviously difficult. And I then thought about the question of how we can methodologically approach a project like this and do justice to this difficulty that possibly this is about global processes, but how do you capture them? And so I chose an approach that I find very interesting for this type of thing, which is called incorporated comparison, and was coined by Philip McMichael. And I have a quote here from one of McMichael's texts that I think very well captures this approach. And he says, rather than using encompassing comparison, a strategy that presumes a whole that governs its parts, it progressively constructs a whole as a methodological procedure by giving context to historical phenomena. In effect, the whole emerges via comparative analysis of parts as moments in a self-forming whole. I call this incorporated comparison. That means we shouldn't presuppose a whole, we shouldn't make strong presumptions about how global capitalism operates. It's more a question of piecing together different parts to, in the process, create a fuller picture. And one way of doing this is to use a multi-scalar method, meaning that it's not possible to just look at the global level and observe global trends, or just at the national level. I think we need several scales at which research takes place. And so I decided to combine essentially two things. I decided to embark on a more superficial, if you will, mapping exercise of non-industrial strikes around the globe, but based on newspaper research. And then I also looked at one specific region of the world, macro region of global capitalism, Western Europe, which I found interesting because there are profound processes of deindustrialization that have taken place, and look at three more specific instances of strikes or strike waves to look into my question into greater detail. And these strike waves were the railway strikes in Germany, the junior doctor strikes in Britain, and the general and feminist general strikes in Spain. So what did I find? I created, as I said, I created a simple database on the grounds of newspaper research, meaning that I looked at several papers from around the world, namely The Guardian, Publico from Spain, Tageszeitung from Germany, the New York Times, Página 11 from Argentina, the Times of India, and a South African paper. And I then sort of searched for non-industrial strikes in those papers over a period starting from when the global economic and financial crisis hit to a cut-off point, which was where I was in time when I was conducting the research. So it's broadly, I think, from 2008 until the early 2020s. And I found a lot of strikes through looking into those newspapers, but I had the feeling that I hadn't covered enough because many parts of the world weren't quite covered through this newspaper search. And then I went into two online resources, online platforms, LabourStart and LabourNet. And LabourNet is a German resource that actually publish media coverage on strikes from around the world, and supplemented my initial search with what I found there on the issue of strikes in non-industrial sectors, so in the service and public sector. And through that, I then ended up with a data set of 387 strikes covering the countries in dark gray. Obviously, this is not in no way representative of strikes around the world, but still I thought it's a lot of material that allows me to find interesting patterns. And what I then did was embark on a coding exercise where I tried to get a grip on the character of those strikes and understand what their class effects were. Initially, and that's what you see in this chart on the left-hand side, I started out from rather theoretical considerations on the fact that strikes have economic and political aims and how we can classify different strikes on those grounds. But I quickly realized that with this more deductive way of coding, I didn't find out enough on those strikes to really gauge what their class effects were. So I added an inductive move where I try to identify strike patterns by just looking at what types of strikes I was finding, and that's the right-hand column. And I found 5 different strike types. And the interesting thing then was that it was possible to connect the dots, if you will, and connect these concepts and categories, and that way get a grip on the question of class effects of those strikes. And to make this a little clearer, here's a table giving some examples. Essentially, what you have here are the 5 different strike types. then examples of those strikes, and you know, what was characteristic of them, and how that mattered, I guess, from a class analytical angle. So the collective bargaining strike, I guess, is the classical strike over wages and conditions. There were a lot of those strikes to be found. What I found was not necessarily that they were expensive in my understanding of expensive broad solidarity, but they were also not divisive. Okay, you could say they aren't necessarily indicative of class formation, but on the other hand, they also do not necessarily say that there are divisions emerging. And then I found some interesting examples. For example, a pilot strike among Ryanair pilots in Europe, where I found emergent collective agency along class lines still. A lot of people in the media portrayed these pilot strikes as strikes by a group of very privileged workers, possibly a sort of sectionalist strike, which is really not expensive in any meaningful way. But what I found was that on the heels of this strike, flight attendants also went on strike, and I thought that this kind of dynamic is expensive indeed, and shows traces of expansive solidarity. The second type is the extension strike. Extension because trade unions through these strikes try to extend their activities into new areas. And these kind of strikes emerged especially in heavily digitalized areas of the service sector, which I found interesting because that observation went directly against Castells' claims that digitalization, informational capitalism leads to fragmentation. We see here that there are signs, even in those heavily digitalized industries, for example, in the logistics sector, Amazon is a famous example, but also among delivery riders, that forms of solidarity emerge and that they form or join unions and want union recognition. So that was already an interesting observation. Also, another interesting observation was that especially around these issues of union recognition, you also had alliances between core workforces and outsourced workforces. That was particularly relevant, for example, at universities, both in Britain and South Africa, where there were strikes by outsourced workers to be insourced again, which were supported by the people already on the insides of those institutions. Then I found a third pattern, which was very important, I guess, for this era, which I call the expansive and politicized strikes. These strikes were strikes that triggered hostile reactions from the other side, from the state, from representatives of the different political parties. These were strikes in repressive environments. And these strikes were strikes that became politicized because of how contentious they were, and in that sense mattered far beyond the narrow area in which they took place. And in that sense, again, I thought there were indications of expansive solidarity. Then we have a fourth example, which is a fairly easy example from a class analytical point of view. These were usually general strikes and feminist general strikes, which were class-based by definition, because all workers across the country were called to strike. And in the context and in the time frame, these were all very often strikes against austerity and against processes of neoliberalization that hit out at workers. And indeed, I found them in 20 out of 56 countries, and through their nature, these were strikes that were based on a type of class-based expansive solidarity. A fifth example, a fifth type that isn't maybe so relevant for my line of argument are strikes for political aims. And these were strikes that weren't directly linked to questions of labor or of how work is organized. These were linked to mostly political aims. For example, there was a strike against the coup d'etat in Honduras. So we find different types of strikes with different effects, but I hope it has become clear that there were some class effects. And then to round things off, I also looked at these three strike waves in the three countries in greater detail. And again, I asked myself, are they relevant in terms of class formation, or what can be said about the question of class formation and expansive solidarity? In a certain way, I looked at non-typical strikes, so not the low-hanging fruits where you can say, okay, this is a fairly obvious example. If in Britain, for example, the RMT goes on strikes, these are often very politicized strikes linked with an anti-neoliberal to anti-capitalist agenda. I looked at more ambiguous cases because I thought it's better to learn about class effects of strikes if I look at those more ambiguous cases. In Germany, the interesting fact about most of the militant strikes in the railway sector is that they are led by a union that is an occupational union with certain conservative leanings. So they're not part, for example, of the DGB, the big union umbrella in Germany. They're outside of that umbrella. Their longtime leader was a member of, or is a member, he's resigned, but for the entire period that I investigated, led the union, was a member of the CDU, so the Conservative Party in Germany, and still they embarked on very militant tactics, which I found very interesting. And the reason for this was also because the other big union in the railway sector in Germany colluded closely with management, and so I found that they triggered a dynamic where they forced the other union also to take a more militant stance, and through that really win important concessions for railway workers. This union actually won last year a 35-hour week, which is quite remarkable in the context of German labor relations. The junior doctor strikes by nature are ambiguous in class terms because of the contradictory class location of the workers, highly qualified people with fairly good career prospects. And what I found here was what was important about these strikes is that they took place in the context of the politics of austerity that has been prevalent in Britain for a very long time now, and that these strikes turned into proxy struggles for the NHS, for a national health service that is based on the public provision of healthcare. So in that sense, it had class effects that went far beyond what the constituency actually demanded, which was better working conditions and less stressful working conditions for junior doctors. And in the third case, the general strikes and feminist general strikes in Spain, what I found interesting, one was these were strikes that were obviously very broad and broadly based and against the politics of austerity that was imposed on the population of Spain in the context of the Eurozone crisis and beyond. But also that connections with social movements emerged in those strikes, and last but not least, the fact that these strikes possibly transformed themselves or were revived in the form of feminist general strikes that made demands that still had a very important class effect, in the sense that they demanded an end to precarious work, in the sense that they even demanded a new form of organizing the economy. So there was a clear anti-capitalist sentiment and direction visible in those strikes. And also because these were strikes that were aimed at reducing ruptures that divided workers, and that were strikes that were aimed at creating better conditions for actually expansive solidarity among workers by removing some of those obstacles. So I guess all these examples, all these different examples show that there are forms of inclusive, expansive solidarity which can be read as signs of working class formation. And so to conclude, what I find is that, yes, Castells was onto something, I guess. Processes of deindustrialization had at times a very disastrous effects on class relations. I guess that's possibly more the topic of my book before this one, which is called The Thatcherite Offensive, and is about the Thatcher government in Britain and how it restructures class relations in Britain. But, and that's the important point here, Castells did not see, when he made that observation, that there are new forms of trade unionism and labor activism in the service sector, and he didn't see how trade unions continue to be very relevant in the public sector. And in both of those sectors, there's ample evidence, I find, of working class formation. And so I would say, as a general verdict, Castells and Castells's claim is, as a general statement, a general observation, is difficult to defend. And all in all, I would say that Panitch was right in saying, yes, this reorganization of global capitalism does not mean that working class formation vanishes. It takes on new forms. Which brings me to my last and very tentative point, if I still have 1 minute or two. I guess my book, and I said at the beginning that I finished my research for this book in September or October 2022, was written with an optimism of the will, to quote Gramsci. It was an optimistic book, and was a book that was very much written in a moment where I saw, well, there is a certain revitalization of trade unionism in countries, for example, like the US, like Britain, where we hadn't seen strong trade union activity for a long time, and where these new forms of trade unionism also emerged in new sectors of the economy, or emerged in the public sector, which possibly in the past hadn't been seen as such an important side of trade unionism. I think this is not very long ago, but I think we are in a different historical moment now. And so I want to finish a little bit by reflecting on what's going on and by opening the debate a little bit. Obviously, we see what I really find, yeah, I guess the only adequate term for this is really the rise of fascism in the US, and the rise of and the strengthening of far-right politics across the globe. And what we also see is, and I'm now looking more at my region, Western Europe, a fuzzy picture of possibly something new emerging along the lines of a military Keynesianism, some massive spending on the militarization of the societies in question. We see it in Germany at the moment. We see it in Britain. This is paired with the politics of austerity, particularly pronounced in Britain, but in Germany, we will see the formation of a new government very soon. And my hunch would be that there will be cuts to especially certain parts of the welfare state. And we also see what I would call a subterranean Trumpism. And with this term, I mean, we do not just see the rise of far-right parties like Reform or AfD in Germany, or Vox in Spain, but we also see a fascination with the Trumpian playbook and this sort of mode of politics, not just among conservatives, but even among centrists. And I would interpret, for example, Starmer's recent decision to cut benefits and expand defense on against this background. And I suspect what we will see in this context is attempts to further encroach on workers' rights, especially the right to strike. The right to strike has been under attack for a long time in the process of neoliberalization that we've seen, and there are quite a few indications that this is going to intensify in the coming years. So what does this mean for the issue I'm interested in here? I guess even more than before, these public and service sector strikes play an important role in fighting back these attacks. And also, I would say, and I don't see any other way, if we're sort of combating fascism, then we need a broad popular movement and a broad movement that develops real power. And I fail to see that kind of movement from emerging if it does not include organized labor, or if organized labor doesn't play a hugely important role in those movements. And I guess that's the task of the day, if you want to call it that. And I guess to illustrate what I'm saying here is, in Germany, for example, we have seen mass demonstrations against the far right in recent weeks and months. They were quite impressive in terms of the numbers of people who turned out. But what we know so far from sort of surveys on who took the streets and went out to demonstrate is that the people who were in the streets were mostly people with a high formal education who voted for the left or the center left already. And I think that illustrates the weakness of these movements, that signals that it is not enough for these types of demonstrations to take place if you want to fight back fascism. It needs to be a much broader alliance that is anchored in organized labor. And so I think unions have a key role to play, and these kinds of strikes that are still going on, that are happening at present. For example, in Berlin right now, we have public transport strikes. These play an important role to form something like a popular front, possibly, which could be an answer to the rise of the right in the present moment. Thank you very much.
Right. Thanks a lot, Alex. Really exciting book, really exciting research, and yeah, very much looking forward to the discussion and especially all the questions that you've now raised about the current situation and the implications of what you've looked into. But before then, obviously, let's listen to Andreas's commentary. So yeah, floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Alex, for the excellent presentation and also overview of really this vast book project. Thank you, Ben, for inviting me to be the comment person tonight, which I'm very happy to do. And it's such a vast project. Yeah, I don't think it's possible for me to pick out all the positive things of the project, but there are also some I'm going to mention which you haven't mentioned in your overview, Alex. And I think that indicates a bit how broad and vast the project is. And so let's go for that. So in general, this is really impressive work. It's organized in 4 parts across 2 volumes, moving, as I see it, from the conceptual methodological to the empirically concrete. And I think Alex successfully demonstrates that collective action or class struggle in non-industrial sectors can also result in class consciousness and class formation. Yeah, and I thought it was interesting, Alex, how you located that within the debate between Panich and Castell. So I think, yeah, that works really well there. And I also thought your empirical case studies, especially the specific foci on the German railway sector, the British Health Service, but also in the Spanish general and feminist strikes, really worked very well to underpin your main argument. But before looking at those empirical contributions, I want to pick out 2 more conceptual contributions, which I found really helpful and useful. So in your first chapter, you develop this position of qualified, or you draw on this concept of qualified ethical naturalism. Yeah, and on the basis of that discussion, Alex in his book develops a normative pro-worker position for global labor studies. And I think that's really a major contribution, not just when we look at the question of strikes, but actually that's a major contribution for all our work in critical political economy. Yeah, because as you point out, capitalism does harm workers, however much it is regulated. And according to you, then there's a clear normative imperative for academics. And I quote from Alex's book here, being on the side of workers means being for workers, exercising their class power and advancing their interests against capital, and for workers resisting and challenging capitalist class domination in the process. That's page 42 in volume 1. And I think that's really an excellent contribution. I'm currently supervising the dissertation of an undergraduate student, and she's also a trade union activist. And then in one of the supervisions, she said, oh yeah, but of course I work for the trade union, but does that not negatively then bias? Yeah, she thought it was negatively bias my study, because of course I'm pro-worker. And I just said, not to worry, went to the shelf, grabbed out Alex volume 1 and say, read chapter 1. That's all you need in order to justify why you are in a normatively pro-worker position in your argument. So I thought that's the first for me, that's really a major contribution. Secondly, I also felt that it was very helpful how you distinguished between different types of academics. And I liked in particular your development of this notion of academic worker. And it clearly then also allows us to argue on the basis of the concept that academics too are involved in class struggle at their workplace. And especially in our times, it's of course the struggle against casualization of contracts. And it was really interesting to see those 4 different categories. And I suddenly thought, I mean, I'm not very well integrated into German academia, but I suddenly understood, I felt, why there are some academic colleagues in Germany who write very critical, very left kind of academic inquiries, while at the same time, in their own practice at their workplace, are very conservative when it comes to, or very reluctant when it comes to speaking up in support of casualized colleagues. And I thought, yeah, that was quite illuminating. But I also felt that your discussion of academic worker is really also a call for us to reflect on ourselves. Okay, so we call ourselves critical political economists. Okay, so that requires then particular ways of how we engage in political economy research work. But actually, what does that also mean for us of how we behave in our own day-to-day relations at the workplace? Yeah, and do we speak up for other colleagues? Do we participate in mobilizing when it is about securing the rights of casualized workers, or do we simply produce critical stuff, but otherwise actually just toe the line? And I think that's a really important call for every one of us to think, to reflect about our own actions at the workplace. Now, coming more to the contents related, of course, I was very sympathetic to your class relational perspective underpinning the book. I think that, of course, works extremely well when we look at the class formation, not just as a group in itself, but of course also how it relates to capital. And I thought it was really good how that was then rolled out and applied across your empirical research. This railway sector strikes in Germany, to me, were a particular interesting case, because not living in Germany, I always just followed it a bit through the newspapers, and there was a lot of critical arguments against this minor small trade union organizing the train drivers, because they said, oh, they're just representing sectional interests, they're not interested in the wider good. And it was interesting that even the other trade unions sometimes was involved in these kind of negative discourses, I felt. And that's then also the question, how do trade unions see their role? Yeah, do they represent workers, or do they just want to defend their position as a trade union vis-a-vis other trade unions? And I think at some stage there was even the discussion of a law which some trade unions seem to support, that it should not be allowed that these smaller trade unions actually cause strikes and carry out strikes. Perhaps, Alex, you can say a bit more about what that law initiative, whether that led to anything or not. So it was quite interesting, and I would agree with your assessment. No, these kind of strikes are also moments of class consciousness, of class formation, and it's important to assert that in our research. And finally, I thought what was really interesting was your emphasis on these strikes in Spain, whether it was the general strikes or the feminist strikes, because there you made 2 claims. First of all, that it's not just trade unions which organize workers, but workers can also be organized in other organizations, such as the M15 Occupy social movement. So I think that gels also well with what Maurizio Azzeni, for example, argues that when we look at labor struggles, we shouldn't just say, oh, we just focus on trade unions, because actually we may miss quite a bit of labor struggles if we do that. So first of all, there are other organizations. And secondly, you also expanded your focus into the sphere of social reproduction. Yeah, and strikes is not just things which take place at the workplace over wages and working conditions, but it also affects issues such as education, care, consumption. And that was part of what you uncovered within the chapter on Spain. And again, that too involves processes of class formation. So these are, to be honest, colleagues, these are just a few highlights of the two volumes. Yeah, I'm not claiming to point out all of the highlights, but for me, these are the kind of key highlights I took from Alex's book. But I want to end on two queries. So first of all, yeah, you did work out the fact that there are also other organizations than trade unions involved in struggle, looking at Spain. You did point to the sphere of social reproduction being also crucial for these struggles. But could one not say that actually these dimensions are always there, sometimes more visible, as in the Spanish case, but perhaps even in the railway strikes in Germany or the junior doctor strikes in the UK, those dimensions must have been there. And I think, for example, in the UK, there was also quite a bit of cooperation between the junior doctors and organization social movements such as Keep Our NHS Public. Yeah, so I think conceptually, perhaps, the starting point has to be that there are always other organizations, not just trade unions, and that there will always be a sphere of social reproduction, sometimes more prominent than at other times. Yeah, so in a way, then the question is, how did these dimensions play a role when we look at Germany and the British case in your analysis? And then finally, exiting the factory, I think you opened up very well by saying, well, this is in a way a development which has happened, especially in the more industrialized world or the global north. Yeah, the shift towards the service sector and public services becoming more important. And I think you rightly pointed out that actually in other parts of the world, in the global south, of course, there are massive factories and there are lots of strikes which are being organized in industrial production sites. And perhaps my final question to you would be, okay, how can we then think those different strike movements together, the kind of non-industrial sector strikes and the industrial sector strikes? What do they have common? How can we draw linkages across those different moments and perhaps also move towards some sort of relationships of transnational solidarity? Thank you.
Right. Thanks a lot, Andreas. Really insightful comments. Really appreciated how you emphasize the dimension of social reproduction and the dimension of the transnational. I think that's, yeah, really excited about the discussion around these points. So yeah, with that, we're now opening the floor up for questions from the audience and questions and comments, obviously. So if you have anything you'd like to raise, any additional questions you'd like to ask, just raise your hand and we can get into it. Until then, maybe I can throw up a couple of questions of my own to start us off. One is just sort of a minor question that I noticed throughout at one point in your presentation, Alex, you mentioned that one of the categories of strikes you found were specifically strikes for political aims, and that you considered them potentially not as relevant, or at the very least not as specifically relevant to the question of class formation. And I was a bit surprised by that. I figured that even strikes for specifically political reasons, I would assume, are are reflective of class agency, because you have class actors using their class identity or their ways of organizing in that way to achieve something. So I kind of wondered how you see that difference, or why you made that sort of qualitative difference there. And then I have another question, kind of focusing on what you said towards the end, basically. So the whole dimension of the rise of fascism, or at the very least the rise of the far right in large parts of Europe as well, because it's a real key tension in terms of discussing the role of labor, discussing the role of trade unions. Looking at Germany, it has to be said that sort of traditional working class voters are perhaps the biggest group, or the most sort of in terms of like the electoral polls, the largest group actually supporting the far right, the AfD. So how does this gel with the progressive role of trade unions? Like how do you see current trade unions responding to this, and how do you think they should respond? Like what role can union activity, be that strikes or other activities, actually play in combating that? So yeah, those were my questions. Again, other questions from the audience, please raise your hands. Otherwise, oh yeah, David has a question.
Thanks. Yeah, no, that is really interesting discussion and questions, and I'm looking forward to hearing the responses as well. I guess I was interested in the idea of like looking for class formation when you look at strikes, because or rather the distinction between sometimes strikes produce class formation and sometimes they don't, which obviously then raises the question of, well, what does class formation look like, and what does class non-formation look like? And I would have thought, if I was to close my eyes and guess rather than actually do any research, that what we see is a bit of both in most of the time, that there is some form of solidarity and there's some sort of disintegration of solidarity, because it's difficult to keep going within capitalism, because there's various mechanisms to try to disunite us. So I guess I would think, don't we always have a bit of class formation and a bit of non-class formation until we've managed to transcend capitalism? That's kind of what we're going to be struggling with. So I wonder if we really can say it. Sometimes there is a class formation and sometimes there isn't. And the second one was a bit more on the final just comments around the kind of rise of fascism and militarized Keynesianism and that kind of thing, which really got me thinking, because I was trying to think, well, because you were sort of saying, well, you need to have organized labor to successfully challenge the rise of fascism. But then I started to think, well, what really, I mean, capitalism is a system of domination, and at certain points, when it's most contested, it turns to fascism as its means of repression. So in some senses, the strength of organized labor will prompt more fascism rather than less, perhaps. And if we think about what was the end of fascism, well, it was obviously did require the military to end fascism. The last episode of fascism was a military operation, and the post-fascism context was essentially the enforced moderation of organized labor, especially in the West. At least it was about trying to contain and limit organized labor, so that you basically get rid of the radical elements through things like Taft-Hartley and McCarthyism in the US, and then similar initiatives elsewhere. So anyway, those are all the thoughts that, I mean, obviously, I do think that the more organized labor is, the better. I just wonder whether we can think of it in terms of an attempt to create a non-fascist type of society, rather than as a. Then I was thinking perhaps more we think of it as a way of sustaining ourselves when we live within the fascist period of capitalism, rather than as a way of trying to stop capitalism being fascist, because I'm not sure that it would produce that outcome. Anyway, those are the types of things that I was thinking of. So if you've got any thoughts on that, thanks. I'm looking forward to reading the book as well. I just want, sorry, one final thing. Did you, in terms of the period, was it all quite? Did you go back further at all in terms of the history of non-industrial strike action as well? Because I was just interested. I haven't had a look at it. I haven't had a chance to look at it yet, but I will look forward to reading it. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, David. I'm not seeing any more hands, but yeah, a whole bunch of easy softball questions all around. So yeah, why don't you respond to those, Alex, if you want?
Oh dear, loads of really interesting and good points. I fear that I can go on for 15 minutes now. I still try to be brief. Andreas, your 3 points. To me, one thing is crucial. A lot of the labor studies and global labor studies literature equates trade union power with class power, working class power. And I think that's a serious conceptual mistake. And the reason for that is that obviously, you've talked about it already, there can be configurations where trade unions have an effect that actually divides workers. In one of the cases that I looked into illustrated that perfectly. The other railway union in Germany, the EBG, which is actually part of the DGB, the big union umbrella in Germany, and politically, possibly, at least on paper, more to the left than the GDL, the occupational militant union that carried out those strikes, colluded closely with management when it came to the privatization of or the quasi privatization of the German railway sector. It's still a national industry, but it's run like a private corporation, and the other union played a key role in it. And that illustrates how important it is to divide the capacities of trade unions from class power, and also to take into account, as you rightly pointed out, that there are other ways for workers to organize, and that unions also work in conjunction with other political actors. On the social reproduction side of those strikes, yes, I didn't explore that in great detail, but you're absolutely right in terms of saying that the other 2 strike waves also mattered in terms of social reproduction. For a start, the junior doctor strikes concern an area that is crucial to social reproduction, which is healthcare. And obviously, the whole question of how care work is carried out and under which conditions care work is carried out was addressed in those strikes, and how it should be organized at a national level, at least in the realm of healthcare. And then another point I think is important in both the railway strikes and the junior doctor strikes, which is that that there were demands for restricting and reducing work hours, because workers said they're simply exhausted. And I think these types of demands, which have come to the fore of labor struggles recently in very many sectors, actually. I mean, we see it in the German healthcare system, we see it in the railways, we see it in public sector strikes, we see it in very many areas. The fact that people say they're simply exhausted, and they can't work these long and crazy hours, and work hours need to be restricted, concerns the issue of social reproduction. So in that sense, there's also a link to the issue of social reproduction. And obviously, this is also linked with the question of how much time and how much energy you have to do your actual unremunerated care work in your household. So obviously, if you win additional free time, that potentially also frees up time and energy to do care work. And to do unpaid care work and reconcile it better with paid work. So I think the demand for reduced work hours are crucial in those strikes, and they touch upon the question of social reproduction. The question about industry is really crucial, and I'm glad you raise it. It's very important for me that I come from a Marxist materialist standpoint, and so I'm interested in working class formation. My point is not to say, for example, like Guy Standing argues in his stuff on the precariat, that there is a new class actor, and that's the sort of workers in the public and service sector. No, I would say that working class formation concerns working people across the board, people who are wage dependent across the board, no matter whether they work in the service sector, in the public sector, in the industrial sector. For me, it was just a heuristic to critically assess these discourses that said, oh, we are sort of in a post-industrial age, and so the working classes don't matter anymore. And so I would say, you know, in a way, it's a very classical answer that, you know, if you start from wage dependency, if you start from the despotism of production and the fact that you have bosses who control the labor process and other people who have to carry out what those bosses say, if you start from the divide between mental and manual labor and the so-called expertise of the people who do conceptual work and the fact that other people are denied this expertise, then you have a common ground between industrial workers, public sector workers, and service sector workers, and you have grounds for solidarity. And obviously this is an abstract argument, but the fact that we see in these strike waves not just these big public sector and service sector strikes, but we've also seen this massive car worker strikes in the US carried out by the UAW, illustrates that, you know, this is possible to operate as a joint labor movement as it always was. The role of the UAW in the present moment is a different issue that I can maybe look at when I come back to the fascism question. Bernd, on your questions, strikes for political aims. Well, it had to do with the nature of this type of newspaper research. So I then read up on the coup d'etat in Honduras. I don't have a lot of information. It's one of 387 strikes. So I didn't have enough information to really gauge the class effects of this particular strike. I would have had to look into it much more deeply. But from that rather superficial point of view, it was hard for me to pinpoint any direct class effects. Obviously, any kind of collective action of workers that involves the strike weapon somehow impacts class relations. But my observation in the case of those strikes was rather it's hard to pinpoint this with the information that I have. The question around fascism, I think, is absolutely crucial, and I already briefly alluded to it when I mentioned the UAW, which has just now welcomed Trump's tariffs on Canada, which I think is a disastrous move because it contributes to normalizing fascism in the US. To cut a long story short, and you're obviously right that we have to look into these very ambiguous pictures that we get if we look at working class communities and how they vote. Now, if we look at the recent German general elections, for example, you find that trade union members or the share of votes for the AfD, the far-right party, was slightly higher among trade union members than it was in the general population, which is quite striking and which says, yes, you know, there is no easy translation. It's not enough to just be a trade union member for you to develop a political stance toward fascism. A lot more has to happen. And there is a lot of research, especially in Germany, by the way, on you know, shop stewards, for example, who are excellent shop stewards on the shop floor, and at the same time, because we don't have political unionism, but industrial unionism in Germany, meaning unions aren't affiliated with political parties. They may be members of the far-right party and political activists for the far right at the same time as being shop stewards on the shop floor. These things happen. So there's no automatic translation. At the same time, I think we need to qualify this picture somewhat. What is a really important point is that an awful lot of workers are denied the vote. In a city like Vienna, that's 35% of the population of Vienna is not allowed to vote in Austrian general elections because they are not Austrian nationals. And the nationality law in Austria is quite restrictive, so it's very hard for them to become Austrian nationals. So what we also have to consider is that a sizable chunk of workers do not by default become represented politically because they're excluded from the political process. And in that context, I think it is actually a job for unions to realize that this is the case and take up the job of representing those constituencies also politically. I wish, that would be my wish, that unions realize this and say, you know, we have a role to play also in terms of speaking on behalf of these parts of the population, which are never counted when we talk about election results and, you know, how many workers support the far right and so forth. Which I've now, yeah, topics are complicated, so I talk for quite a long time. Thank you, David, for these observations, which are very relevant and interesting and complicated. My view of history is one where I would be against a teleological view in the, I don't know, I guess it's not what you wanted to put across, but there's a danger in saying, you know, if workers go on the offensive, the result will be fascism. I think it's an open process. And I think you can fight back fascism through workers' action. He can win and he can lose. In the early 1920s in Germany, for example, there was a coup d'etat by right-wing militaries, the Kapp putsch, as it is called, which was brought down by a general strike. Now, we all know what the end result of this history was, but there was a struggle. And the response of workers was crucial at that particular moment in terms of fighting back fascism. I would also say, to look for another positive example, there is a liberal story about South Africa, but this story is wrong, which is, you know, people like Mandela resisted and so forth. The apartheid regime was brought down by mass working class action, organized by socialists and communists in the SACP, the ANC, and COSATU at that time. And you know, they were successful in terms of bringing down the apartheid system. They were not successful in terms of thwarting neoliberalization, because this, you know, the developments in South Africa, I think, were completely out of sync with the global picture, with this forward march of neoliberalization and the demise of authoritarian socialism in Eastern Europe. More or less coincided with that, and so it was very hard to push forward towards a socialist South Africa. But still, this is an example of a very successful working class struggle against the far right and a very oppressive regime which is why I think it is important in the present moment to highlight those stories and to highlight the potential strength of working class movements. Sorry, that was very long.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We have two more questions at the moment, one in the chat and one by Jaime. I will quickly read the one from the chat by Rebecca, who basically asks what you think are the prospects of a big labor movement actually uniting and developing radical responses when one set of workers' demands are directly at odds with those of the wider and international working class. She specifically discusses this around the question of workers in the fossil fuels industry, at the examples of unions like Unite and GMB in the UK, who are I suppose to some extent pro-fossil fuels because of the workers that they represent. And then Jaime had another question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really insightful and it's really interesting. And my question is a bit related to the one in the comment section, which is has to do with the relation between distinct working classes who are in very distinct sectors and whose interests can also be at odds. So I'm thinking about the Spanish feminist movement and the Spanish feminist strikes and the demands of care workers and domestic workers, right? And how the fragmentation of their labor and the fact that they work fragmented hours and in diverse households, etc., is the condition of possibility so that other workers in more concentrated sectors can also work infinite amount of hours, right? Never-ending hours, because they can purchase this reproductive labor. So I'm just wondering if you dig in. I believe you've somehow mentioned this in your replies already, but maybe you could comment a little bit further on how we overcome these differences between these two working classes, whereby ones are characterized by more stable contracts, even if with high levels or rates of exploitation, while the other ones, are more fragmented. And it seems to me that these interests are at odds. And when talking to them, individually or separately, I don't know what would be the ways, right, where we could convince or sort of put their struggles in common. I think the issue of temporal expropriation, so the expropriation of time, is one very nice common sort of issue that goes through all working classes. But yeah, I'd just love to hear a little bit more of your thoughts on these divisions. Thank you.
Right. Thanks a lot, Jaime. Yeah, those were the questions. So yeah, feel free, Alex.
Yeah, great, important points here. Theoretically, to start from the theoretical level, I would always say that that's a point Nikos Poulantzas makes, from whom I quote extensively, especially in the first volume, that in the capitalist mode of production, there's a tendency, especially through the workings of the capitalist state, to unite the capitalist class into a power block and to divide workers, although there are also already divisions at the economic level. And so I would say that, and that's why I like the class formation framework so much, that tendentially the capitalist class or the capitalist classes in capitalism exist in a tendential state of unity, and workers exist in a tendential state of disunity. And then the point about this whole class formation framework is to highlight that there is one factor that creates a potential for change, which is the fact that there's conflict and that there's class struggle always. There's always conflict and there's always a tendency for people to join forces somewhat. Now, this can be very limited, and both of you very rightly pointed out very important contradictions And this also goes back to some of the things that David and Bern observed about how it is possible to strike compromises with certain sections of working classes, and that way incorporate them into capitalist social formations. So yes, all these tendencies exist, and yet what I found important is that I found in those struggles that I was looking at, that there were still forms of solidarity emerging across those types of divisions. They aren't necessarily stable, they aren't necessarily applicable to everyone positioned in a certain position, but they still emerge thanks to those struggles. And now, obviously, this means, yes, I do not want this to be understood as some teleological tale where we say, oh, we only need to wait a little bit and then people join forces and this becomes bigger and bigger. But I rather want to point out that there's always potential for expansive forms of solidarity. Maybe that's the place where what Gramsci calls organic intellectuals come into play, who play a role of fostering those connections. And these are possibly also quite visible in some of the strikes I looked at. And what I found also striking, and that's particularly important, I guess, for what you said, Jaime, is that a lot of the unions I looked at into more detail very much banked for a long time on colluding to some degrees, in some ways or another. I mean, it depends a bit on the country you look at, on the union you look at, with management to win concessions for core workforces. For a very long time, that was the general strategic line. And you can't blame the unions, because obviously they need to represent their members and they need to win something for the members. And even if that's at the expense of other groups of workers. For example, I've done more detailed research in a different research project on temporary workers in Germany, and you always deal with this split of core workforces and casualized temporary workforces. The political point, however, I think in a lot of struggles that was visible, was that the unions started to realize that neoliberalization undermines sooner or later also undermines these core workforces. And they become smaller and smaller, and their constituencies are dwindling. So even if you look at it from a very narrow sort of economic interest type point of view, I would say they have learned that it is really important to branch out and to include other groups of workers. Now, maybe that's a very optimistic picture. The picture is too optimistic, surely, because there's still those divisions. There are also huge tensions inside the big unions that organize in those different sectors in terms of where they're headed and where they want to go. But as a general observation, I've found in many cases that at least significant parts of union movements across Western Europe have come to the realization that there's not much to gain for them by colluding with neoliberalism by banking on the fact that they're somehow spared by the politics of austerity and so forth. And what I also found interesting, that especially in the contexts where social democracy closely colluded at the political level with neoliberal forces at the economic level, like New Labour in Britain, like the SPD in Germany, and unions started to play a more independent political role, simply because they realized, well, the traditional post-war channel, we're the economic arm of the labor movement, social democratic parties are the the political arm, and we can go through the political arm who wants something politically, they came to the realization that that doesn't work anymore and that they need to play a more independent role. So in that sense, yes, it is. The picture remains messy. It remains a huge difficulty, and they haven't addressed the specific issue of the climate crisis, which, you know, brings some of those contradictions into sharp relief. But there's always potential, I would say.
All right. Thanks a lot, Alex. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good closing statement, actually. So, yeah, thanks a lot again, both to you and to Andreas for the fantastic presentation and discussion. Thanks a lot to everyone for your questions, and yeah, found this very insightful, and yeah, looking forward to the next one. And yeah, with that. Oh, yeah. And with that, yeah, thanks a lot, everyone, and enjoy your evening.
Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed presenting.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks. See you soon.